So thank you guys so much for being here with me today. Welcome to Rainbow Bunch. We're talking today about food and shelter insecurity, particularly as it affects LGBTQ plus folks. So my name is Emily Van Kirk. I use they, them pronouns, and I work with the Office of Diversity, Inclusion, and International Programs here at Tarleton State University. We serve all campuses, and we do all kinds of programming, but one of my favorite areas to work in, particularly as a passion, is serving LGBTQIA plus students. As a queer person myself, it's just very important to me. Let me know via chat if that word's gonna bother anybody. I can excise it from my vocabulary for the day, but I personally use it as self-identification, so it'll pop out quite a bit if nobody objects. So before we get like real heavy in, I want to ask y'all, what do the words food and shelter bring up to you? So I just shared a link via the chat that should take you to a poll everywhere. This is my first time using it while presenting virtually, so like bear with me and let's see if I can, change the share real quick. If y'all would go ahead with the words food and shelter, what do those things bring up with you, like word association? Go ahead and respond either via that link or you can text that long code that you see at the top there. And can y'all see my new share screen? Okay. And feel free to submit more than one, okay? And feel free to submit separate, like what does food bring up for you? What does shelter bring up for you? Okay. If you want to link phrases together, put an underscore in between the words or a tilde. That's a fun trick. Okay. I'll give it another minute. See if we have any other thoughts we want to get out there. As a talkative person, resisting the urge to just fill the air is really hard. Okay. Okay. So let's talk about this a little bit. And if you have more thoughts, you can send them in while we're talking about this. Okay, all right. I'm gonna admit somebody real quick. Let them know what we're doing. Hi, St. Luke's.
Hi, sorry I'm late.
No worries. We just got started. What we're doing is we're talking about food and shelter, and I asked folks what those words brought up for them. We're doing a poll everywhere. You can respond via the link in the chat, or you can have folks text this long code to 37607 once to join, and then just text your message. We want to talk about what those words bring up for folks.
Okay,
what are the associations? Mm-hmm. And we'll give them a couple minutes. But I want to point out, if you want to link phrases, you can put a tilde between words or an underscore. which is a neat little trick. And the more times a word is entered, the larger it is on this, okay? So that means that the word basic has been used quite a bit, right?
Mhm.
I want to point out a couple other words I'm seeing in here. Basic needs, needs, human, entitled, sustenance, humans, hierarchy. Hierarchy is an interesting one. Maslow's. Is that Maslow's hierarchy of needs in here? Okay. Essential, basic needs, right? Okay. So while we gather a few more responses, where do you think I might want to start here? Feel free. I was letting all other folks know earlier. Feel free to unmute to let me know what's up. Raise a hand in the chat or to just type a chat response.
I think because everybody's definition of food and shelter differs because everybody comes from different backgrounds. So their definition could mean, just the basic necessities, while another person's could mean like steak and lobster and things like that.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Going off of what Caitlin said, I totally agree. And I think it's important, especially for this meeting, to kind of reach an understanding as to what food and shelter really is. And it's that it's essential and it's a human right. And that's super important to like understand before we talk about like the LGBT community, and because like their rights are threatened still. And that's what this is like meant to represent, I feel like.
Sure. Thank you. Anybody else?
I would agree with that. Like when I think of some of those basic human needs and basic things, somebody else put Maslow's hierarchy, and I was like, yes, that's what came to mind from myself as well. Without some of these basic things, it's really hard to go to class. It's really hard to do daily functioning and things like that. And so different people have these different understandings of what food and what shelter mean, because different people have had different interactions with them and then different interactions with other basic needs as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So y'all are all really on point. Before I explain more, I don't want to cut anybody off. Anybody else have anything they want to share? And remember, I can't see your faces or anything, so you've got to be a little assertive. So it is to get us all in the same place, but it's also just to bring to mind that this is something that's really part of everyone's life. It's really personal for me. Food and shelter brings up warmth, it brings up safety, it brings up family, security, right? And it does bring up basic human rights, basic human needs. When I wasn't sure where I was going to sleep at night, when I wasn't sure when my next meal was going to be, it was considerably harder to worry about my grades or my student org activities because my basic needs weren't met. So thank y'all. Thank you so much for participating. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing on the poll everywhere, and let's go ahead and switch back. That's my other song that gets stuck in my head. I'm so sorry, y'all. So some expectations that we're setting today. We're going to talk about, what do food and shelter insecurity mean? How many people are living with food and shelter insecurity? And how many LGBTQ folks do we think are living in the US, and how many might be potentially impacted? So let's just stop here for a second. Like, what do we really think that food and shelter insecurity means?
Kind of
do
like
we have a
what you
sense of what
said.
that means?
Oh, sorry. Kind of like what you said along the lines of like when I didn't know my next meal was going to be, when I didn't know where I was going to sleep at night. It's just not having the stability of how am I going to get sustenance that I need to survive, and how am I going to protect myself from like harsh weather conditions, and just where I feel safe.
Okay. How many people do we think are living with food and shelter insecurity in the US? It doesn't have to be an actual number. We can just throw out like a percentage or a rough estimate. Do we think it's a high number or a low number?
Considering that you're not necessarily saying that they're like totally homeless or like they're like starving or anything like that, I'm gonna say a relatively large percentage, like 15-20%.
Okay.
Yeah, I would agree. I'd agree around like 20%. I was thinking that. Went to a conference previously and learned that it's even larger among college students. Because that insecurity could mean like couch surfing, so they don't think they're homeless, so they don't report homelessness. But definitely they don't have a secure shelter.
Welcome, welcome. Somebody else just joined us. We're talking about expectations and kind of setting our ideas up, like what we think food and shelter insecurity might mean, how many people we think might be living with food and shelter insecurity in the United States, and how many LGBT people do we think might be living in the US and might be potentially impacted. This is something that's always interesting to think about. How many LGBT people do we think there might be in the US? Do we think it's a lot of LGBT people, a little LGBT people? Because that would directly relate to how many people might be impacted as LGBT folks by food and shelter insecurity.
I'm not totally sure if this statistic is true, but I read it a couple weeks ago and I thought it was super interesting. 1 in 4 Americans currently identify as part of the LGBT community, is what I read. And I can guarantee you that a larger portion of the LGBT community definitely live with food and shelter insecurity than the cis community.
I would be really interested in seeing if that was bracketed by a certain age range, because the number of people who identify within the LGBT community usually is slightly different depending on what range of ages you're looking at. So that's really interesting. I'd love for you to share that with me. Thank you, Chloe. So yeah, we're kind of, we're not really sure exactly, but we've got some ideas. So that's why we're going to talk today, because when we don't have grounding, we need to go look for information. So we're going to talk about food and shelter insecurity in the US. We're going to talk about how it impacts LGBTQIAP folks. And then we're going to look at some resources on these issues. So let's talk food and shelter insecurity. And remember, feel free to chat, raise your hand, go ahead and unmic if you need to, let me know. So when we talk about food insecurity, you're right. I'm not talking about people who are strictly starving. We're talking about a lack of consistent access to enough nutritious food for an active, healthy life. So it's not just, I haven't eaten in 36 hours. It's, I can't afford to eat anything except dollar menu McDonald's. And if I go to try to provide myself with quality food, I won't be able to meet my rent. Or I'm living off of nothing but ramen because it's the only thing I can afford and buy in bulk. Or I live somewhere with a food desert where I don't have access to fresh, healthy food. And so I'm living off of convenience store food. Food insecurity. A lack of consistent access to enough nutritious food for an active, healthy life. It could also mean somebody who's maybe splitting meals into smaller portion sizes because they're having to make one meal serve the role of 3. Or somebody who's maybe having one meal a day because they can't afford multiple meals a day. So food insecurity is much broader than just, I don't have food to eat. I don't have enough food to eat. I don't have good enough food to eat. It's a very broad issue. Similarly, shelter insecurity is a multi-dimensional umbrella term as well. So when we talk about housing issues, a lot of times we get stuck on literal homelessness, which is a huge problem, but it can obscure some of the other issues, such as excessive housing cost burden. And that's defined by the federal government as when somebody has a housing cost that's in excess of more than 30% of their budget. So if your housing costs more than 30% of your income, you're already at an excessive housing cost burden. And that can make it harder for you to bounce back if there's any kind of difficulty financially. So it means that you're like one financial difficulty, one emergency away from being vulnerable to homelessness. And in that way, you become shelter insecure. It can also include homelessness, residential instability, evictions, and other forced moves, being forced to live with family or friends to share housing costs, not because you want a roommate, but because you literally wouldn't be able to afford to live. Couch surfing in the way that Alexis described earlier, overcrowding, and living in substandard, poor quality housing, or living in neighborhoods that are unsafe and lack access to critical amenities. So the reason that I specifically mentioned that housing or how homelessness can obscure some of these issues with housing is because when we focus on literal homelessness, which is easier to count in a lot of ways, we sometimes don't see the impact of these other practices. But homelessness is a huge issue as well. So food and shelter insecurity is more widespread than you may think, has broad impacts and effects on all parts of life, and includes negative impacts on health outcomes. So if you don't have good access to quality food, particularly for children, or if you don't have a stable living environment, particularly again for children, can have extremely deleterious effects on your health. In 2019, food insecurity impacted about 10.5% of people in the United States, declining from a high of 14.9% in 2011. So we're improving. However, there's a lack of a true standard measurement when assessing shelter insecurity because it's an umbrella term. But when we talk about it, a lot of times we defer to the literal homelessness. So we do have a measurement of that. And approximately 567,715 people were literally homeless in 2019. So that's not addressing the folks who would be homeless if they didn't have 3 different couches to rotate through, or the folks who would be homeless the second they miss a rent check, or the folks who would be homeless if they weren't able to stay with their parents, or 1,000 other people who are stuck in incredibly difficult situations, fragile situations, where they're a breath away from losing their home. So this is our first little stopping point for some discussion. I wanted to ask, have you or someone you cared about ever experienced food or shelter insecurity? And corollary to that, are you familiar with the local resources near you?
I had a roommate who did, and she ended up living with us for a few months last year.
Thank you. Lots of people in my life have been food insecure. Anybody else? We have some great resources in the Stephenville campus, primarily through our Purple Pantry, but there are also some great resources in the Erath County community and plenty of resources in other communities. But a lot of times they're affiliated with local community centers, churches, and other religious organizations. Yeah. Alexis has the resource hookup from some old jobs. But yeah, sometimes it can be hard to even know where to turn when you come into these situations because you may not even have thought to connect with these resources before. Sometimes folks don't know. Anybody? Okay.
I think because how widespread that actual definition of food and shelter insecurity, what they actually are, we probably know way more people than we realize who actually are that. Because people that I know, students that I know, they may eat, but they're not eating healthy, like nutritious stuff. And if they didn't live with their parents, they wouldn't be able to live anywhere else. So I think that number is pretty much higher than I originally thought. And then as far as food resources, I know Purple Pantry is great. And then like I'm representing St. Luke's, and we have a food pantry every 2 weeks on Tuesday. And so I try to let the students that I know keep them aware of that. And sometimes they can get there and sometimes they can't because it is during the day. So one thing is that if anyone does need it, my name is Mackenzie, by the way, and I work with college students. And
Nice
so
to
if
meet you.
anyone does need food and can't get there, then I can bring it to them at a later time. So, and there's wonderful food pantries popping up all over because of the pandemic too. There's just so many more people in need this year. And I can put some info in the chat.
Please do, please do. Yeah, we have a dearth of shelter resources in our immediate area. I think the closest thing is in Granbury, and it's particularly for battered women, and they don't even list it. You have to get a referral. So we have a dearth of resources for housing in our region, and the nearest housing resource is going to be in DFW. Hey, Karen, I saw that you joined. We're talking about whether or not folks have experienced, or someone they've cared about has experienced, food or shelter insecurity, and if they're familiar with local resources. But yeah, so it can get kind of complex because sometimes it's easier to find access to that food than it is shelter, or folks don't know how to navigate it. And then it's also just really embarrassing. So at one point when I was a student and I was experiencing food insecurity, I had a professor who knew, and her way of attempting to help me was to try to hand me a voucher for a free milkshake in front of the entire class while telling me how sorry she was that my boyfriend had been fired and that we didn't have enough money for food. So it's one of those things that people can be kind of hesitant to talk about. Yeah. And she meant really well. I'm still on wonderful terms with that individual, but it can be a really disheartening thing to go through. It can hurt people's pride. It can make people feel uncomfortable with disclosing what they're dealing with. And then for the resources to be difficult to find or navigate can be challenging. So that's why it's important to try and locate those resources and make yourself knowledgeable in advance, because you never know. You never know what folks need. Any other thoughts before I move on?
I was just gonna say, I know growing up, especially in even though my family and I are considered middle class, we're at the very lower end of middle class. So growing up, it was more like, okay, like we're gonna have like bologna sandwiches for dinner, or we're gonna have like, some spaghetti, just like cheap, easy meals, but still somewhat nutritious. But then I had a friend who was I consider relatively wealthy, because you know how some people have fridges out in their garages.
Oh,
So
yes.
yeah, they
That's a
had
rich
two.
people thing.
They had two. One was full of just like frozen food, like you had your chicken nuggets, you had your frozen chicken, frozen meats, and then frozen pops and like ice cream and popsicles. And another fridge was just nothing but drinks, stocked full of like Dr. Pepper, Gatorade, Powerade, every kind of juice. And then she had like candy and trail mix and everything. And I'm like, and I would go over to her house and I'm like, how can you afford this? Because to me, that was like a special treat every now and then,
Right.
Right. So I was completely baffled by it, because it's like I have no idea how someone could afford that, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, that really resonates with me. That really resonates with me. Thank you for sharing. Also, in the chat, there's some conversations about spaghetti with butter for dinner. Yes, yes. Anybody ever have fried bologna sandwiches as a special treat? That was my dad's thing. But yeah, so the differences in experiences with food can be really visible. Housing, it's usually a little bit more concealed. Yeah, yeah. Or like name brand sodas was a big one for me. Name brand sodas. When I started being able to consistently afford name brand sodas.
Name brand anything.
Yeah, yeah. Name brand toilet paper was another big one, but that's a different conversation. So it's funny, these little markers that we find, right? So let me go ahead and advance the conversation. So let's talk a little bit about LGBTQIP plus folks in the US. Sorry, I thought I bumped the set of, wow, brain. I thought I bumped this slide up a little bit. Apologies. So how many people are there in the US and how many people are LGBTQ plus? The US Census says that there are 328,239,523 people in the United States, and it's estimated that there are about 42,000 LGBTQ people who are ages 13 plus per the Williams Institute. That's a group that does legal studies outside of UCLA, and we get that info from the census. Wow, I don't know how this slide slipped through me, guys. I'm so sorry. We get that information about the number of people from the census, but the number of people who are LGBTQ is not tracked through the census. All right. The number of same-sex partnerships will be tracked in 2020, and there was a ton of advocacy done attempting to get the number of LGBTQ plus people tracked on the census in 2020, but it failed. So how do we get the info about who's LGBTQ? Well, mostly people aggregate a bunch of different information from a bunch of different studies together, which is what the Williams Institute has been doing to try and find these numbers, which is part of why when Chloe shared the number that she found earlier, I'm assuming, is that she, her accurate, Chloe? I don't want to be an ass.
You're fine. I usually go by they, them, but she, her totally works too, especially considering we don't really know each other.
I can use they, them. It's perfectly fine. That's my favorite one too. But when we talk about LGBTQ folks, the numbers can be hard to get together because we're not gathering it on any kind of grand scale, right? We're not gathering it in the census. We're not gathering it in any other place that we gather demographic data. We're just gathering it when people put together specific research attempting to research LGBT pops, which makes it difficult to gather really quality ideas of how many LGBT population there is.
Well, and we had talked in ally training. You had talked about. Sorry, I didn't mean to like just interrupt.
No, you're fine.
But we had talked about that. Not everybody also self-reports honestly. That there are
Yes.
people that are in same-sex partnerships or have had same-sex partners, but they identify differently than in the queer community.
Yes, absolutely. And that's not even always just an issue of honesty too, because some people might have a same-sex experience and might not identify as queer. They might not end up identifying as queer. But that's also an interesting thing. So the Williams Institute actually differentiates most of their data based on whether you want to talk about same-sex partnered individuals or LGBTQ individuals. So they have columns of data based on both of those categorizations because of the distinction you're talking about right there. So it does get complicated. So the context for the numbers on LGBTQIAP folks in the US can get a little muddy because you'll find different numbers depending on what reports they're pulling the information from to calculate it. A lot of times the numbers are estimates because they're finding something with a good sample size. They're saying this is the number we found in this, and then they're doing math to estimate what that would calculate out to for the larger population, because they're not going to calculate it or to pull it from the census like they would for racial demographic data. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Goodness. So, just a little bit more discussion. Did you realize how many LGBT folks there were in the US, and how could the decisions to not directly track them in the census impact the future?
If we don't know how many people make up the community, we don't know how to like necessarily assess their issues. We don't know how to properly combat the problems that they face on the scale that they do.
Yeah. Nail head, yes. And a note on that 13 million number, that's people over 13. Not tracking will hinder the community a lot. Statistically, individuals in the community face more struggles than the cis community and LGBT or the hetero community. Oh, Karen has a great point. Census data is used for funding from governmental entities and even grant funding foundations. Yep. Yep. Anybody else? Yeah. Yeah. Did we realize how many LGBT folks there were in the US? So the fact that it's pulled from different reports is why I mentioned being interested in where you got that specific number from, Chloe, because your number is probably coming from a report that was done on younger folks, because when they look at the reports from different age groups, they find higher rates of identification within different age groups. The younger a person is, the more likely they are to identify as LGBTQ. So when you average it overall, the average rate is something like 4%. But when you look up to people under 30-ish, we get up to like 7 to 10%.
Yeah, I think the demographic was like 13 to 25 or something. I'm still like looking for the actual stat that I found, but yeah, I'm pretty sure it was like a really like low age demographic.
Yeah, no stress. Just if you find it, send it to me because I'd love to include it in some of my other work, along with apparently a typo checker. But yeah, so it's easy because we're not being counted to discount how many of us there are. So a lot of this information here on forward is going to come from the Williams Institute, because what they do is they take dozens of reports from different areas, they aggregate the data, and they analyze it. So let's talk about shelter insecurity. More than 1 in 5, 2.16% of LGBT adults in the United States are living in poverty, compared to 15.7% of cisgender straight adults. According to a 2019 report by the Williams Institute, the same people found that among LGBT people, poverty is especially prevalent among racial minorities, bisexual people, women, trans people, and younger people. So even within our own communities, there are breakdowns where further aspects of identity can cause deeper marginalization. And although 70.1% of non-LGBT adults own their own homes, that number is just under half for LGBT adults. Other Williams Institute studies have found that home ownership is even lower among LGBT racial minorities and trans people. Same-sex couples are less likely to own their homes than different-sex couples, and married same-sex couples are less likely to own their homes than married different-sex couples. So even if we're married legally, we're still facing the same kinds of obstacles that we might be facing as unmarried same-sex couples. Also, per Williams, a variety of studies have found that LGBT people face discrimination when trying to rent apartments, which is legal on a federal level, and secure mortgages, among other discrimination experiences related to housing. Studies find that between 20 and 45% of homeless youth identify as LGBTQ, approximately 2 to 4 times more than the estimated percentage of all youth who identify as LGBTQ. So that thing is phrased oddly to me. So just to make sure that we're on the same page, it's just a really disproportionately high number of people that are queer youth who are homeless compared to the total number of youth who are queer. Like it should not be that easy to find a queer youth in homelessness compared to how easy it is to find a queer youth.
Okay, so just to clarify, because I want to make sure I heard you correctly. So for those who identify as LGBTQ, approximately 2 to 4 times of those individuals identify as homeless.
20 to
What's that?
45% of the homeless youth
Mhm.
identify as LGBTQ,
Mhm.
which is 2 to 4 times more than the estimated percentage of all youth. I don't know where they're pulling this number from, so that is a little confusing. But basically, it's really unlikely that they'd be able to get that number. It's disproportionate to the number of youth who identify as LGBTQ. Does that make sense?
I think so.
The number of youth who are LGBT is so low, but they're finding so many in the homeless population.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, I told you it's
Okay.
phrased really oddly.
Yeah.
So the estimated percentage of youth who is LGBT is really low. But when you find the percentage of youth in LGBT or homeless shelters, 20 to 45% of them are LGBT. Does that make sense? I feel like they should have phrased it that way, like started with the low percentage of LGBT youth and then talked about 20 to 45% of homeless youth are LGBT.
Yeah. When you flip it like that, it makes more sense.
Yeah. And then among young adults aged 18 to 25, LGBT people have a 2.2 times greater risk of homelessness than non-LGBT people, according to a 2018 study from the University of Chicago. And studies have found that LGBT youth and adults, especially trans people, face barriers to accessing homeless shelters and services. Commonly, this can revolve around the fact that shelters and services are often gendered. So they'll put trans women in with men, they'll put trans men in with women, or they might at sometimes be related to the fact that these services might be related to systems of faith that are not always welcoming to LGBTQ folks. So that's another issue that has happened. So let's talk about food insecurity. More than 1 in 4 LGBT adults, 27%, approximately 2.2 million people, experienced a time in the last year where they did not have enough money to feed themselves or their families, compared to 17% of non-LGBT adults. 18% of LGBT adults reported that they or someone in their family went without food for an entire day in the past 30 days. 14% of LGBT adults reported running out of food for their families and not having money for more in the past 30 days. And 9% of LGBT adults reported that they ate less than they believed they should in the last 30 days. 6% of LGBT adults reported going hungry in the last 30 days. And among LGBT people, 31% of women and 22% of men reported not having enough money for food in the past year. 31% of LGBT people aged 18 to 29 and 29% of LGBT people aged 30 to 49 reported not having enough money for food in the past year. And these are all pulled from a report dated 2020. You know, it would be really interesting. And I don't know that they have that data, but I can tell you from personal experience that many of the students that I work with on LGBT issues also access that resource. Sorry, this is an upsetting bit of information. So again, this food insecurity also is complicated by other identity factors. Among LGBT people, 42% of African Americans, 33% of Hispanics, and 32% of American Indians and Alaskan Natives, and 21% of whites reported not having enough money for food in the past year. So you see those folks who are affected by racialization in the United States are more heavily impacted by food insecurity. 35% of LGBT people with a high school degree or less and 29% of LGBT people with some college reported not having enough money for food in the last year. 30% of unmarried LGBT people and 15% of married LGBT people reported not having enough money for food in the last year. 33% of LGBT people raising children and 24% of LGBT people not raising children reported not having enough money for food in the last year. They also used multivariate analysis to examine the participation in SNAP, so that's Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, that's food stamps, for LGBT individuals and adults in same-sex partnerships. And they found that LGBT adults are 1.62 times more likely than non-LGBT adults on average to report not having the money they need for food. LGBT adults are or excuse me, let me make sure I get the age in there. LGBT adults aged 18 to 44 are 1.36 times more likely than non-LGBT adults of the same age to have participated in SNAP. And adults in same-sex couples, because they do separate out that, are 1.58 times more likely than different sex couples to have participated in SNAP in the past year. So if you are married to a partner of the same sex, you are over 1.5 times more likely to have participated in SNAP in the last year. Yeah, absolutely. And then you think about the fact that we have heightened rates of disability within the LGBT community. Think about the fact that we have demonstrable impacts of racialization and racial discrimination within the LGBT community, and it gets a lot more complex. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then the fact that it's legal in the state of Texas to fire someone for being LGBT. It's legal to deny them housing for being LGBT. And you start to see how this can all come together to create an environment in which queer people are just not able to fully care for themselves. And it's not seen as a big deal because we don't have enough demonstrable evidence of it. So our final little discussion question here. What do you think might be some of the contributing factors to the higher rates of food and shelter insecurity in the LGBTQ plus community?
I've noticed these numbers are higher for folks who don't have good relationships with their families. And so maybe they were forced to go out on their own earlier than other folks would have been.
Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else?
They're a minority group. They face discrimination on a daily basis.
Certainly.
You said state laws prohibiting, or state laws where people can deny individuals from the LGBTQ community shelter or access to food. Like you can't come into this restaurant kind of thing because you're from that community. So, like you said.
I should clarify what I said earlier. There just aren't any laws prohibiting discrimination. There are no laws explicitly allowing it, but when you don't make a law against it,
Right.
I just want to be on record with an accurate statement. Thank you. Thank you, Mackenzie. Thank you, Caitlin. Anybody else? I do think that the lack of information about how large this population is can be a contributing factor, and I just want to go on record with that statement. I find that when I talk about the support that this community needs, oftentimes there's an impression, oh, well, it's not that many people or it's not that big of a need. So there's a lack of knowledge and a lack of awareness. Ooh, excuse me. Any other thoughts before we take a look at those resources?
I think one of the things that's often overlooked too is how mental health contributes to this. And so folks in this community sometimes have had traumatic experiences, or, just the process of coming out they've had to deal with, or they have some pre-existing mental health condition that doesn't allow them to have the full capacity every day to respond to their own needs.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And I mean, that's a complete and total aspect of your health. Like mental health is physical health is mental health. Like I think those are completely intertwined, and it's something that we need to take into account, because being part of a marginalized identity can produce a real strain on yourself, when who you are as a person is looked down on and rejected, it has an impact on you. And the closer you are to visible queer identity, like personally me, I can skate around it and people can not see me. But one, that's exhausting for me. And two, it's not always possible. Other people are much more visibly queer and they have to deal with that. Like that's a whole nother layer of effort they have to expend while trying to access these resources and support, while trying to hold down a job, while trying to build those relationships, while trying to maintain the relationships with their family. Thank you for bringing that up, because it can also relate to the struggles at hand. Yeah. Let me go ahead and I'm going to show you this list here, but I'm also going to open these in just a second. I have them in another tab and I'm going to show you each of them. And then despite my typo issue, I do have fancy resources. So like I said, the majority of these are pulled from the Williams Institute because they do such a good job of pulling together the research and really analyzing it and letting us see what's going on. But a lot of the rest came strictly from the government itself. If the government would give me research on queer people, I would use the government's research there too. So let's go ahead and take a look at the resources that I pulled to learn more and to support our LGBTQ folks. So yeah, let me know if I got the new share up successfully. So this, oh, yay, thank you. Switching shares always freaks me out. This one is just really an article from the Center of American Progress. I keep swapping my prepositions, but it talks about the issues of employment discrimination and discrimination in housing and healthcare and how it impacts LGBT folks in a little bit more detail, and can be really helpful in understanding some of the issues that we talked about today, because I really glossed over quite a bit. And it has a lot of really cool graphs. Yeah, so if you want to know more details, this one's really good. Let me move my little control bar down. And then this one is from the National Center on Transgender Equality. See, my prepositions are gone. This is fantastic. So while we do not have a federal non-discrimination law strictly about LGBT identity, we do have several laws that are supposed to protect us for fair housing in general. And this explains some housing rights and the rights that we have regardless of explicit protections for us. So if you want to be a good ally to queer folks, this is a good one to bookmark. I think they also have this as a PDF if you just want to save it and retain it. Yeah, here we go. Fair housing, transgender people. So transequality.org is also just an excellent resource in general if you want to learn more. This here, Urban Wire, Housing and Housing Finance. This talks about the particular situation facing housing instability in LGBTQ individuals. And it talks about some ways we can push back against that. I really like it because it has some action steps, some ways that you can take action if you're so motivated. It's also really emphatic about getting LGBTQ Americans counted. That's a big piece of advocacy for quite a lot of people because, if you're not counted, you're not counted in or counted on. This is the LGBTQ Poverty Initiative. I'm really about abolishing poverty. That's just me. Like, ever since I've learned about MLK Jr.'s Poor People's campaign, I've been anti-poverty. So if you're interested in learning more about the fight to abolish LGBTQ poverty, this is a place to check out. And then this is the National Alliance to End Homelessness. Great resource for any and all things related to ending homelessness. They've got stuff about racial equity regarding this issue, gender and sexuality equity, and can educate you quite a bit. This is an issue that affects all kinds of folks, not just LGBT people. It profoundly affects our nation's veterans, profoundly affects our nation's indigenous peoples. And it's something that we could all stand to pay a little bit more attention to, because it only is a hop, skip, and a jump from I have to pay 50% of my check to rent to I missed my rent and I'm about to get evicted to I'm staying on my friend's couch to I wore out my welcome to I'm living in my car to my car got repoed to I'm on a bench. Like, I'm sorry to be like that, but we do not have a safety net in this country, and a lot of people have found that out the hard way. At this time, I want to share with you one link. It's a link for an assessment. If you would be so kind, I'm going to get onto this. It's not even a link because I have a QR code because I am lazy. I want to have y'all easy peasy lemon squeezy, not have to find anything, but I can also share the link if you would like. This is easily found just by using a little photo scanning app on your phone, or you can go to a website and pull it up as well. Or if you'd prefer, I could paste the link into the chat. Can you all see this? This is all the information I have for you today. Oop, I was trying to minimize that, not make it big. Apologies. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much for taking the time to discuss this with me. Your contributions were absolutely necessary. Why is that going so big every time I open the chat? I'm sorry, y'all. I'm afraid to open it. We try it. Yes, I will post the link. Absolutely. Give me 1 second. See if I can find my sticky note. I'm going to stop the recording real quick. Oh, gosh. Where's my little control tab? Here we go. Yes.